Hello and welcome to the Indy Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Kevin Tumlinson. Hey, Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing great. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Kevin Tumlinson is an award winning and best-selling author, a prolific podcaster and public speaker, and the chief brand officer of Author Anchor. We're going to be hearing more about that a little bit later on. And Kevin has been on the podcast twice before talking about writing pivots and the power of humility, which was a fantastic conversation, and acting on inspiration anywhere. And so today we are going to be talking about finding virtual marketing assistants. And I think
Yeah.
this is so interesting because I think that the idea of virtual assistants is, I think people are kind of familiar with that, but the idea of marketing assistants specifically,
Yeah.
I was very interested in this because I think it's both the thing that most writers would like to outsource and
Yeah.
maybe one of the more difficult things to outsource. So just talk a little bit about how one goes about finding virtual marketing assistants.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, first of all, what you just said is kind of the heart of why Author Anchor was founded, which, just for background, Author Anchor was created by the guys who created BookBrush. And they were using VAs, people that they were hiring from the Philippines to help build BookBrush. And people who use BookBrush kept asking, do you do any, marketing services for the author? We're looking for done for you marketing. And there's no real viable model for that kind of thing and marketing on behalf of someone else, unless you do something like a virtual assistant who's basically their job is to take on those tasks for you. So that was kind of the origin of the whole thing. You can, of course, use the virtual assistant for much more than just marketing, but that's the primary thing that we find authors come to us for. But I think you asked about how to find. Was that your question? I want to make sure I actually answer the questions.
Well, actually, just let's step back and get the context of when you say marketing, what kind of activities are you thinking there?
So, any task that you've ever been told is something you should be doing as an author to market your work is up for grabs here, beyond simply appearing in public as yourself. So, we have VAs who either are trained or come with a natural skill set for things like running your ads, running and managing your ads on Facebook, Amazon ads, Google ads, whatever. Social media is another big one that people are often looking for. They don't want to have to manage all that stuff and manage posting, maybe creating and crafting and managing your newsletter. Basically, anything you can ever think of that you would do online to market your work is something that you can hire a VA to do. And we often train VAs in some very specific things. Some of that, by the way, is like, let's say you wanted to create a Shopify store. We have some of our VAs are skilled at doing that and experts in doing that sort of thing, or setting up and running a Kickstarter campaign. So, yeah, it just kind of, what are your needs? What are the things that you're doing to market yourself that you really hate doing or really need some help with? And then you can just bring someone on at a pretty reasonable rate through Author Anchor to take that stuff on for you. And since I mentioned it, that rate is effectively around 750 an hour. There's a caveat to that in that it sort of depends on how many hours you book them for, because we do this in like 10-hour increments. But the way Author Anchor works is there's like a $99 sort of admin fee that happens each month per VA. And then you have to pay the VA a minimum of $5 an hour in 10-hour blocks. So it works out to about 750 an hour out of your pocket if you do kind of the minimum, number of hours or whatever. And you can pay them more, because I've had people ask about that. You're certainly welcome to pay them bonuses, pay them more per hour, whatever you feel is appropriate. But the $5 an hour is the absolute minimum.
So, one of the things I think is interesting about some of the things you mentioned, like social media and newsletters, as an example, is that I think that marketing is there's certainly the marketing of a book,
Yep.
but I think that marketing also has this aspect of the marketing of the author
Yeah.
and, getting your persona out there and
That's right.
letting people
Yeah.
get to know you and all that kind of thing. And can you talk a little bit about how an author can balance that sense of marketing being about themselves as well as about their books and the idea of getting help doing that?
One of the things you want to do right away, no matter how you're handling your marketing, is you want to establish your brand. And as you know, Maddie, I'm a brand expert. That's kind of my background. So what you're trying to do is you're doing what you call platform building. which platform in the marketing world just means the reach you have to your potential audience. Now, where are you finding the readers and what are your best options for reaching them? So what you're trying to do is build a way for readers to identify you and know you. Now, when it comes to having a VA help with that, there are a lot of things that I could recommend. There's a lot of things you could do that would sort of give you an ace up the sleeve here, but you could actually have them manage, you write, maybe you prefer to write your blog posts and you just need them to handle posting it. Or you have them draft a post and then you give it your voice. You go over, edit, rewrite, and give it your voice. So you got things like that. But some tricks you could use that would be very helpful. Video is a very powerful tool and becoming much more so now. People are, you're seeing a lot more video ads on Facebook and elsewhere. What I would recommend is, you've got this VA, do a Zoom call like what you and I are doing and give them a list of questions to ask you and do a cultivated, crafted interview that they can then, you can get a VA who has video editing skills. They can go cut this into shorts, cut it into long form, but they can have things ready to go on TikTok, on, Facebook Reels and on YouTube Shorts and things like that. And then maybe some longer format stuff to go on YouTube. That's just one way that you could do that. But what you really want is to convey to your reader or potential reader who you are as an author and the type of work you do and the style that you have so that they can more easily connect with that. Because readers are always looking for, most of the time, what readers are looking for is something the same but different compared to the last book they just read. So you want to give them as little friction as possible in finding you and finding your work. If you're really blessed, the last book they read was yours. So you want to make sure that they're finding the next book right away. But those are just some like general tips for how to use a VA for that kind of thing. The moral there is really, you have to have a brand and a voice established in order for them to help you amplify it. So be really clear on what your brand is before you bring someone in to kind of help manage it.
Well, one thing you said that I really like is that, especially in this age of I think video is becoming a stronger and stronger way of reaching out to people because so far it's one of the things that is not quite as plausible to do with AI. If somebody's seeing you in a video, then it can be pretty sure it's probably you.
Yeah.
Realize there are exceptions to that rule, but let's just say generally. And I'm also a big fan of repurposing content. And
Yeah.
so I can imagine a scenario where authors lean much more heavily into video outreach, recording a little message for their fans to put on social media or whatever, and then having a VA take that and then do all the other things with it. Like you've already
Right.
provided the personalized content, and what they're doing is
Yeah.
tapping into expertise in repurposing and video editing or social
Yeah.
media or whatever those things are to make the most of the content.
Right, exactly. Yeah, what's great is having someone that helps you with doing all of that means that what you can do is kind of just really quickly fire something off without worrying about what it's going to look like in the end product. If one of the things that you want as part of this service is to have someone who has that video editing skill and has a social media background or something, you can request that when you do the little free discovery call that we offer. But, I like being able to just hand things off so that, because one of the things we tell people is like, we're here so that you can do the one thing that writers always say they want most, which is just write. So as much as you are willing to hand off and capable of handing off to free you up to write, the more you can hand off, the better. So I think that when it comes to like the video side of things, a lot of authors may not have that as a skill. Some do. I mean, some wouldn't hand that off if you paid them to. I'm kind of one of those sometimes because I've got that background, but I get lazy. I don't want to have to do this stuff all the time. I really just want to, if I want to just quickly talk to this microphone and this camera and then have someone else take it and turn it into all the various things without me having to oversee it so that I can just retire over here and write my stories, which is what, which is what I started off this business for in the
Yeah.
first place. So.
When you were talking about, you have specialists in various areas. And again, let's start talking about independent of Author Anchor and then use some Author Anchor examples that
Yeah.
I think another decision people sometimes struggle with is, do I go to a specialist or do I go to one person who's going to get to know me? And so obviously, if you want video editing, then you need a video editor. But I
Mhm.
also think that there's this sense of if you're working with one person consistently and you're providing feedback as you go along,
Yeah.
that social media post didn't really sound like me or don't use that kind of clip art, to advertise your books or whatever it might be, then over time, that person's voice can become more and more like yours and you are
Yeah.
representing yourself, even though you're doing it through another person. Do you have thoughts about that idea of going for a specialist versus going for a generalist?
Yeah, one thing you should keep in mind is that you do not have to try to hire one person to be all things and wear all hats. Just like you trying to do everything can pull you in a million directions and stress you out, the same's going to happen to a VA. So, one of the great things about this service is that it's cheap enough you could bring on additional resources, but just setting all that aside, because that sounds like promotion. And what you asked was, be above and beyond that, should you look at a jack of all trades or should you get specialists? I am a big fan of specialists. I'm a big fan of bringing someone in who has a specific skill set to do a specific task. That said, the idea behind a sort of general VA, it's not that they can do all the things, but that they know how you want them done or they know your process and your procedures so that when you do bring on an additional resource, they can manage that resource on your behalf. So, really, what you're kind of aiming for in your first VA is somebody who gets to know you and your brand and can perhaps create things in your voice or at least help you to generate things faster so that you can shape them into your voice. And then when you are ready to take on a new task, if they don't already have that task, that's when you start looking outside for a specialist. The great thing about human beings is that we can specialize in multiple things at one time. And a lot of these VAs have backgrounds and training in multiple things that are useful to the author. This isn't just author anchor. A lot of VAs in general can kind of do this. So what you might do just to start is, it's more about the more important thing when it comes to, let's just go back to video. When it comes to video, like posting on YouTube or something like that, what's more important than how great it looks is how consistently you post. So maybe you find some baseline minimum version of your brand so that you can quickly post content every week, right? And then the idea behind using a virtual assistant anyway is you should be able to increase your revenue potential with a VA. And I want to loop back to that in a second. But if you're increasing your revenue potential, that means that more money should be coming in, which means you should be able to, you know, segment some of that off to bring in a specialist at that point. And that's when you bring in somebody who's got, higher end video editing skill and can take that on. And that's the only job they have. Every week you're handing them maybe 5 videos and they are cutting and splicing and, doctoring it up and posting it online so that they can draw in more potential readers for you.
And do you think that there's like if someone is, let's say someone's never worked with an assistant before, they're going into this kind of relationship new.
Yeah.
And I always assume that there's going to be this period where things get a lot worse before they get better.
Yeah.
So my primary experience with this has been podcast production. Over the life of the podcast, I periodically had people help me with it. And I always assume that the first couple of episodes are going to take me twice as long as they normally would because it's just a complicated process. And this person's, doing it new for me. And
Yeah.
also, I'm adding the complication that I always want to be able at any moment to pick up the process myself. Like, I don't want to just turn it over to someone because, like, if the person is on vacation, but I have an episode to get out, I need to be able to do that myself. And so
Right.
I'm putting
Right.
this extra complication on it that, like, they have to be using the same editing software that I use and they have to be using the same, way to make thumbnails that I use and so on. But
Hmm.
I think that even if it's not complicated like that, there's got to be this period of time at the beginning where things are feeling worse before they feel better.
Yeah.
Do you find that? And how do you advise people about
Okay. So, first of all, rule number one is you never hand off anything that you don't have fully documented. You need an entire process. And that's going to sound daunting to some people, but here's the magic secret: use the VA to create the process. And that's your first task. It's actually the perfect first task for a VA. So let's say that you're bringing someone on board to help you with editing and posting podcasts. So before you hire someone, before you even talk to the service, you might want to spend the time documenting how you do it, as detailed as you can get, and including what software you prefer. I like to use Canva for thumbnails. I like to use Adobe Premiere for video editing, whatever it is you do. So when you go to do the discovery call with Author Anchor, you say, I need somebody who can use these pieces of software, that has this software and knows how to use it. So that's part of the process of finding somebody. When they come on board, the best first task is to have them first run through that whole process that you created, and then do something for you, produce something for you, but document as they go. You could do this, especially if it's something you haven't documented fully. Let's say I use Kickstarter all the time as an example, but let's say that you wanted someone to set up and run a Kickstarter campaign on your behalf. Your first task with them might be, or should be, create a process that tells me how you will build and run a successful Kickstarter campaign, including best practices. And when they produce that, and you give them a set number of hours to start with, take 2 hours to start it. Tell me what you've got after 2 hours. Okay, that's looking good, or that's not looking so good. Let's change this. Now take 2 more hours. And what happens is you spend the first month or so going kind of slow, because there's several things you're learning as you're utilizing this kind of process. One, you're learning about their communication skills. And you're also learning about the best way for the two of you to communicate with each other. So, like, for example, I can't stand email. I get thousands of emails a day. I have no more bandwidth for additional email. So I've discovered the best way for me to communicate with a VA is via Slack. I set up a Slack channel and we go. And in fact, sometimes it's even better for me if we do some kind of text message exchange. So maybe I set them up with a special, Google number or something so that they can text me. So, it just depends on your preferences, but I can't do email, so I don't do email. So you learn how each of you communicates best, and you learn how to work together in the process of figuring out these processes that you're going to use going forward. And at the end, what you've got is a documented process that you can use as well. Or if if your VA needs to move on, they graduate, with their master's degree or something, or they're not working out, whatever, you can bring on someone new and you've got this process already developed for them to learn and use. So the next onboarding process moves much faster. But to your point, it's also something you can use so that okay, here's my logins for the software that we use. Here's all the assets that I need. Here's the way we handle laying out the timeline for videos or whatever. And all that stuff is readily available to you from that point forward. So that's how to handle that kind of thing. And I guess the unfortunate truth, I don't really see this as unfortunate. I see it as inevitable. But the reality is it always takes a bit of time up front to get the motor going, because if you just expect them to come in already knowing how to work with you, you're going to have a really bad experience, because they've got to not only learn how to work with you, but learn, here are the things that you prefer. Here are the tools that you require. Maybe they can have suggestions, like, hey, if we did it this way instead, or use this tool instead, it would save you $50 a month, or it would be, 10 times faster. So it's very good to spend that first month with the awareness that you're probably not going to be as productive as you want to be, but you're going to build towards being more productive in consecutive months following.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, this is more specific to Author Anchor, and that is that idea of having an organization or a person who's kind of being the intermediary. And so the
Mhm.
best example I can think of where I would have liked to have had an intermediary is having hired someone on Fiverr or something like that, Upwork, I
Yeah.
forget. And we were going through, she was going to help me with podcast production. And we were going through the rocky first weeks. And we
Yes.
were just at the point where I thought, okay, now like we've worked it all out. This is great. This is going to be rolling right along. And then she got in touch with me and said that it turned out that she didn't have as much time as she thought she did. And she wasn't going to be able to do my podcast, which was unfortunate because I had one I had to do that week. So
Yeah,
it
that
was
is
one of those
unfortunate.
ones that part of me kind of wanted to say, I kind of wish there had been an intermediary there who maybe could have seen this coming and like
Mhm.
headed it off. And so, on a lot of those platforms like Fiverr, Upwork, people are just hiring people directly. Does Author Anchor offer more of an intermediary? And if so, what does that look like?
So when it comes to the work you're doing with the VA, you're going to want to be as directly connected to them as possible. So we don't get involved in the middle of that. But where we come in is a sort of HR for you. So if you are having trouble, your VA is not responding, punctually to emails or phone calls or however you're communicating, or they're not producing the kind of work that you are asking for, or they're consistently skipping something or whatever, we're your recourse. You can actually reach out to us and we will, take care of it somehow, probably find you a new VA if it's necessary. Or if you feel you're not getting what you paid for, we can make sure that you're not being charged additional funds or whatever. So that's where Author Anchor comes in. We're an advocate on both sides, really, because unfortunately, and you know this, Manny, that sometimes authors are kind of mean. And so sometimes
No.
their demands can be a little heavy. And I know that's not 99%, especially of your audience, who are all angels. But, occasionally the VA needs an advocate as well. So that's where Author Anchor comes in. These are all people that we source them all from the Philippines, but we get to know them. We bring them into this process and we're training them. There's mandatory trainings that happen every month. We end up partnering with all the names from the industry, like Vellum or Book Funnel or whatever, to train the VAs to use that software or those services. But it gives us an opportunity to kind of get to know these people as people. They're not just, yeah. I should have started with this, but I've had people ask me before. I guess there's confusion because of the word virtual. And
Yeah.
these are human beings. This isn't AI. These are real human beings. They live in the Philippines. Cost of living in the Philippines is dramatically lower than it is in the United States, which is why you're able to pay $5 an hour without it being some form of exploitation or something. It's, this is pretty good money. It's like gig economy money in that region. But that's the way we built this whole thing is, humans helping humans is the whole point of it. So you can get an actual human being that can, help you with the needs of your business. And if you are having trouble with that human being, you've got an entire service that is built around, making sure that everybody comes out happy.
I do. I had written that note down in preparation for a conversation that I was saying. I was going to ask if Author Anchor was considering rebranding this as like remote marketing assistance or something like that, because I do think that like you hear virtual assistants and
I
there is
know. Yeah.
confusion about what that means.
I say author assistants a lot now because that's what they are. And that's actually a key difference between Author Anchor and, say, Fiverr or Upwork. The resources that you hire through us are specifically trained to help authors. So, you might find someone on Fiverr who's worked with authors before, but what are the odds that person who lives in an entirely different region of the world is familiar with the software and services that, authors in the Western world depend on. So we make sure that everybody who comes through gets some sort of minimal training. And when we have every month, we do some new thing that we introduce so that they, we kind of spread around new skill sets. And we get a lot of these folks come in and they've got some bona fides, man. Like, some of them have been building like Shopify stores and things like that. Some of them have their own businesses. So there's a lot more to this than simply just finding somebody who needed a couple of extra bucks. Like, oh, some of these people, this is their career.
Well, since we brought up AI, I have to ask the inevitable question. I think with authors increasingly using AI for their publishing business, and staying
Yeah.
away from the using AI or not for writing, but a lot of authors, myself included, are using it for publishing work. And
Yeah.
so, as an example, if I have a podcast episode and I want to do a Facebook post about it, I'll often just stick the transcript into ChatGPT and say,
Yep.
write me a Facebook appropriate post.
Right.
So, how is Author Anchor anticipating that and continuing to make value from people relying on people and not relying on the machine?
So it's so funny because I've been to 3 or 4 conferences now to talk about this, and at each one, I've had at least one author come to me and say, well, how do I know they're not just using AI? And I'm like, why wouldn't you want them to use AI? Like, you should absolutely demand that they use AI to help them do the work because AI is an accelerator.
Yeah.
And so, you and I use AI for various aspects of our publishing business, specifically because it speeds that up and saves us time, which translates to money. So if you're paying somebody by the hour to do work for you, why wouldn't you want them using AI to help draft a Facebook post or help edit a video or help, create graphics or whatever? If you would do it, then, you definitely want your VA to be using it as well. So now you want to set ground rules, right? Depending on who you are, you may have certain hangups about AI, which are completely understandable. For example, a lot of authors don't want any of their actual writing, the fiction or nonfiction that they write for a living, to ever go into AI to help train the AI. So you would need to make sure that your VA was aware of that. And that was a hard rule. You don't feed any of my stuff into AI. But when it comes to like a transcript or something, like I use, when I do an interview like this one, me, I do a ton of podcasting. I drop the whole thing into an AI called Cast Magic, which gives me a transcript. I take, and I can ask Cast Magic to do additional things with that, or I can take that into ChatGPT. Well, that's me doing all those tasks. Why wouldn't I hand that off to a VA to handle it? They can get, for $7.50, they can knock out that whole podcast episode while I'm writing something else instead of spending my time, editing transcripts or converting them into blog posts or whatever. So,
Yeah, I think
uh,
that that idea of having an agreement with your assistant about the use of AI makes a lot of sense. And I'm thinking, and I think this might be leading into the ROI conversation, which is
yeah.
that I'm going to use writing book descriptions because this is like a more stark example than social media posts.
Okay.
Years ago, I paid someone to write a book description for me for
Yeah.
use on the retail sites. Now, admittedly, I put my book into an AI and it
Yeah.
generates what is a pretty damn good sales description and I tweak it. And so
Yeah.
there, the difference is very stark. Like that's me spending 20 minutes plugging in plugging in the prompt and doing some editing versus years ago, I don't know, 100, 150, however many dollars I spent to get that written. So
Yeah.
now, like if I had a business writing sales descriptions for books, I'm pretty worried because like the machines can do that.
Yeah.
But with an assistant, there's this balance between, well, either I can spend half an hour doing it myself or I can pay someone who's using AI to
Yeah.
spend half an hour doing it. So I think that maybe the underlying question is what work does it pay to think about giving to a person, whether they're using AI or not, that pays you
Any
back as an author from a business point of view?
Yeah, yeah. And that's the ROI conversation. And my answer to that, there's several ways to go about this, but number one, anything that creates friction for your business, for you making more money, is something that you should look at handing off. So if it's taking me, if I'm spending, 6 hours a week converting transcripts into blog posts, that's 6 hours of writing I'm not doing. So handing that off to someone else, if my writing is making me an income and 6 hours translates into a dollar figure at some point for me, then it's worth at least that dollar figure in order for me to hand off that work for someone else to do. I get into a lot of conversations about this because there's people will ask, like, how am I going to afford, $300 to $500 a month for a VA? And and I will respond that you should not be asking yourself that question. If you're asking that question, then you shouldn't hire a VA. This isn't about how do I afford it. It's about how do I use a VA to increase my revenue. That's the whole purpose of hiring somebody. Any business, no matter what the business is, if you sell flowers, if you are a coffee shop, any business hires employees so that they can increase their revenue potential. That's exactly what you're doing as an author. You are a small business owner. You're bringing on a contract employee so that you can specifically so that you can expand your revenue potential. And for most writers, that means you're doing more writing. You're actually able to get more of that done. I am one of those writers. You're probably one too, Patty, but you spent your you spent your years learning how to do this and learning the craft and, pursuing this. And then once we kind of got here, we discovered there's all these other things we got to do. I got to market. I got to post on social media now. I got to, and as technology has increased and become more powerful, it seems like I've got more and more I have to do. And the more of that I do, the less the one thing I started this thing for that I'm doing. So for me, it's worth paying, a few $100 a month to somebody to take on all those things while I just sit and do the writing. It's taken a long time for me to get to a point where that was possible because I had a hard time handing things off at first. But if you can kind of make yourself do it, you come out on top. So ultimately, what you want is you're bringing on, let's say you're paying $500 a month. Let's just throw that number out there. You're spending $500 a month to have someone help you. Then you need to be making it minimum $501 a month off of those efforts. As long as you are making more than you're spending, then you're on the right track. And ultimately, what you want is for every progressive month that goes by, that number is increasing. That assistant is getting better at the tasks that you've handed off to them. Maybe they have some autonomy now. They're go-getters and they can think of other things they can do to help you. You run something by them and they say, yes, I can learn to do that. As time goes by, you're fine-tuning your relationship with each other so that they're handling all the things that are a headache to you and keeping you from making more money, and you're doing all the big things that make you all the money. That's the relationship you're looking for.
Yeah, I found that my own example of a remote assistant, an author assistant, is the woman I hired to do my finances because I hate
Yeah.
doing that. And I wasn't
Yeah.
very good at it.
Yeah.
And what I found was once I talked, my oldest friend. Once I talked her into doing that for me, she retired from a finance related job in the corporate world. And once I found that I had done that, I mean, once we had made that transition of her picking that up, then it became clear that she was very good at anything that was very carefully documented.
Yeah.
Anything that was like walking through a series of items, she was much more diligent about it than I was. And so we just kept adding things. Now she reprices and posts all my monthly book discounts
Yeah.
because she's very good at that. She never misses a platform and she never keys at the wrong number. And then, every once in a while we try something and we were like, that's not really,
Yeah.
it's probably not what either one of us wants. So that idea of both, the concrete ROI benefits and just the headache of I don't have to be up at night wondering what my tax guy is going to say.
Right. Do not discount the peace of mind
Yeah.
as being part of your ROI. I mean, for example, I can mow my yard. It doesn't even take that long,
Mhm.
but it's an hour to 2 hours out of my week where I'm sweating. I'm actually allergic to grass, so I come out look, all puffy and itchy. So yeah, I can do it, and I can totally justify saving the money. But for the $50 or so it costs me to have someone come out and mow it for me, I get to relax, have a drink, not be itchy, not have sinus problems for the next month. I get to avoid all those headaches. So I don't make any money off of that guy mowing my yard, but it saves me on heartache and headache. And that is well worth it. And because I'm not suffering from allergies and other issues, having to take, Benadryl and being drowsy, I'm usually much sharper, able to do my writing. So you see how this works, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We have no trouble with the concept of, oh, I'm going to pay someone to cut my hair. I
Yeah.
own scissors. I own a trimmer. I could probably cut my own hair if I really worked at it, but it's just probably better to let someone else do it. Because not only do you get the convenience of handing something off, you likely will find somebody who is much better at that skill than you are. And you can purposely go looking for that. And honestly, the thing that I think blows a lot of authors' minds when I'm talking about this is a pretty inexpensive way to bring people on board. And if you're doing this right, you are increasing your revenue potential. I think it blows people's minds that, it's inexpensive enough that if I needed someone else, it's not going to cost me that much more to bring that person on. So you don't want to try to get one person who does all the things.
Yeah.
because that becomes your bottleneck. It becomes that the break point. That's the place where if the system's going to break down at an inopportune time, that's going to be it. Just like you don't want to be that person, you don't want to hire and pay someone to be that person. So over time, what you really want is to say, look, I got my person who handles all my admin stuff. She answers my emails, does my social media, does all that kind of stuff. Then I got this person who edits my podcast and posts videos for me on my behalf. And I got this other person who does, my book cover design, because that's another thing you can do here. You can get somebody who does web design, cover design, who does, copywriting, whatever skills you need, as long as it doesn't require them to be physically in your presence or physically in a location somewhere, it's up for grabs.
Yeah, well, I like the idea. I think that the idea of book cover design is a really good one to sort of wrap the conversation up on, because I think a lot of professional indie authors have now recognized that maybe book cover design isn't really, their gig. And maybe they should hire someone who actually has visual
Yeah.
design experience and training to do that kind of thing. And I think once you accept that, then you can look at all the other things that indie authors are expected to do. And this is why I like indie author and not the self-published author, because we're not doing it all ourselves.
Yeah.
And the idea that you can apply that same thing to almost everything else about your work except your writing. And so looking for those things where somebody else is probably going to be able to do a better job than you can,
Yeah.
and then applying that ROI test makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. That's exactly the approach I recommend as the one that works best, honestly. And just to throw it out there, I mean, I do actually know of one nonfiction author who uses the VA to write the books. But what they do is this interview process. They record, she has the VA interview her, they transcribe it, the VA crafts that into chapters. She oversees all that, puts her stamp on it, he edits it, whatever. And then so this VA is effectively a ghostwriter for her nonfiction business. In that case, I mean, she actually says, look, I am an author, but that wasn't what I started out wanting to do. She has a business where she does like coaching and does courseworks and things like that. So, the books are just a handy way to bring people to that. That's the stuff she does.
Yeah.
So she feels no shame whatsoever in having someone else behind the pen. And I've come to realize, like, okay, we have to sort of reframe the way we think of what an author is, because, she's still clearly the author of that work. Those are all her words, her ideas. She just didn't do the typing. Yeah.
Well, I love the idea of this being an opportunity for people to be able to lean into whatever that other thing is, other than the admin, other than the fill in the blank, so that they can make the most of their time. So, Kevin, it's always lovely to speak with you. And if people are interested in learning more about you or about Author Anchor, where can they go to do that?
Well, let's focus on Author Anchor. If you go to authoranchor.com, you will see on that homepage two things that are very important. One is a very handsome man with a nice beard. And the second is really the more important, which is the button to book a free discovery call. And if you do that, you're never going to be obligated on anything, by the way. There's no contracts here. You can try this out. If you don't like it, you're out, right? But what you need to do is make a list. Here's all the things I have to do but hate doing. And the second list would be all the things I want to be able to do but don't have the skill set for. And take those and book a discovery call, and you'll talk to probably Moesha. She's kind of our head of all this there. There's sometimes you'll talk to some others, but tell them this is what I'm looking for, and they will match you up with 3 people to interview to start. And you can, if you don't like them, they'll find you 3 more. So it's a great way to get started. It's very low overhead for the whole thing. And it all starts at authoranchor.com.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Kevin.
You got it.